May I proceed, Judge?
Yes.
Members of the jury, the first thing that Ms. Alvarez told you whenever she got up here and spoke to you in her opening statement was that two things can be true at once. And that remains true now like it was then. The death of Bryan Pata was an absolute tragedy. Rashaun Jones is not responsible. That's what the evidence in this case has shown. The government has tried to take innocent facts that do not equal murder, and build it up and turn it into something that it was not. We sit here today in court 20 years later as they try to take information that they've had and put it in an order where it makes sense. And they've failed. They have not met their burden because they cannot meet their burden. What happened on November 7th of 2006? The government's evidence hasn't shown what happened. Nobody knows what happened to Bryan Pata on November 7th of 2006. But we know what did not happen. Rashaun Jones was not at the Colony Apartments. Rashaun Jones did not shoot him. Rashaun Jones had nothing to do with his death. Rashaun Jones failed a drug test. He went home. He was at home at the time that Bryan Pata was killed. And then he didn't go to the meeting. He didn't go to the team meeting because he was suspended. He didn't want to be around the team that he had just got suspended from. He was embarrassed. He didn't want to be around it, and he chose not to go. There wasn't a coach that called him to tell him he had to be there. Bruce Johnson called him to tell him about the meeting, and he made the decision not to go. And because he didn't go to that meeting, we're here. That one choice has snowballed out of control to where an arrest hadn't been made in 15 years, and all of a sudden now, we go back. We look at the one person who didn't go to that meeting for a completely innocent reason and try to paint this picture, try to use all of these innocent facts to turn it into a murder. The law does not permit that. The evidence in this case has not proven beyond and to the exclusion of every single reasonable doubt that Mr. Jones is responsible. And the evidence has not met that burden because it cannot meet that burden, because Rashaun Jones is innocent. And in a minute, you're going to hear some instructions from Judge Miranda. She's going to tell you about the burden that has to be met in this case. And Ms. Jones-Peabody spoke about it a little bit whenever she was talking to you in voir dire. It has to be an abiding conviction, something that sticks with you today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. Something to where you lay your head on that pillow, you feel comfortable with your decision. You're not wondering. You're not wondering about, doesn't come back. You don't think about it. That's not what the evidence in this case has done. And I want to talk about the evidence in this case. I want to get directly into it, and I'm going to start with Paul Connor. Paul Connor, you heard his testimony played over a video. He was shown a lineup. He selected Rashaun Jones' photograph out of that. But let's talk about the actual interaction between Paul Connor and this person that he saw. Paul Connor testified that he saw this person for 1 to 2 seconds. Paul Connor testified that his vision is 20/40 without his glasses on and 20/30 with his glasses on. Paul Connor testified that he could not say whether or not he actually was wearing his glasses at the time. Paul Connor testified that his vision is so bad it falls below the requirements to drive in Florida unless there's a special designation on his license saying he has to wear his glasses to be able to drive. Paul Connor said that he is nearsighted and he's farsighted. He has to wear glasses for distance and he has to wear reading glasses up close. Paul Connor told you that when he observed this person, they were walking past each other. Again, 1 to 2 seconds of interaction. Paul Connor testified that this occurred at night. Paul Connor testified that there are no streetlights on 77th Avenue. Paul Connor testified that he was shown some photographs in his testimony. He was asked where it was whenever he observed this person, and he pointed here, right near the entrance of the Colony Apartments. And now the government wants to talk about these lights way back here at this other entrance for this other apartment complex, but Paul Connor makes it very, very clear that this is where he was when he observed this person, and then he walks into the parking lot, and the person walks past him. That's where he observes him, right there in the Colony Apartments, not near those lights. There's no shopping center across the street. We see that on this map, the map that the government has shown. This is the apartment complex. This is the shopping center on 88th Street. This is, Detective Segovia said 1 block, but we're talking 1 block, 2 block, at least 2.5 blocks up. That's not illuminating this area. You can see how dark it is on some of the crime scene photographs as well. This is a photograph. I'm showing you State's Exhibit 13. A photograph showing horizontally, parallel with that entrance. You don't see a single light here. Detective Patz has told you that these photographs were taken with a flash. The only light that you see in this photograph is a flash. And then we see this picture, also State's Exhibit 13. This is a parking lot facing the entrance. You see how dark this is, and there's this one globe light. The only light there at that entrance. And what did Dwayne Hendricks say about this one globe light? Well, first of all, in his 911 call, he says, "It's black out here. I can't see anything. It's black out here. I can't see anything." And then when the government got back up to ask him questions during his redirect examination, they wanted to try and establish that the area where he was dark, but the parking lot was well lit. And what did he say? There was one light by the entrance. It was supposed to be well lit, but it wasn't. That was his exact testimony. It was supposed to be well lit, but it wasn't. This was a dark area, and he observed this person for 1 to 2 seconds without his glasses on, and he has 20/40 vision. Ultimately, during Paul Connor's testimony, he admits everything. He says, the question is, so you saw this person for 1 to 2 seconds without your glasses on, and it was dark outside. He says, yes, yes, yes. Not only that, not only were the conditions that he saw this person in bad, not good for a reasonable, reliable identification. And that's one of the things that you are going to be instructed. You're going to be instructed to consider certain factors when you're determining the credibility of an eyewitness identification or selection. And one of them is the capacity and the opportunity of the eyewitness to observe the offender based on the length of time of observation and conditions at the time of observation, including lighting and distance. So all of those factors I just discussed, you're going to be specifically instructed to consider those. Not only that, not only were the conditions poor, but the time between whenever he saw this person and the actual being shown the lineup was 7.5 months. 7.5 months. Members of the jury, if you saw a person for 1 to 2 seconds at night and you were asked to accurately pick a photograph of them 7.5 months later, would you be able to do it? Would you be able to do that? Especially when Paul Connor says that he didn't think anything of it at the time. He didn't realize anything was wrong until the next day. Later in the afternoon that day, whenever he gets to his office and sees the news. That's the first time he realized anything was happening. So he crosses paths with this person at night without his glasses on for 1 to 2 seconds. Isn't anything that sticks out in his mind. It's not something that he immediately thought was something that he should remember. But then 7.5 months, he's able to accurately pick this person out of an identification? No. Nobody could do that. Another factor that you're going to be instructed to consider is whether the identification, the selection was cross-racial. Whether the person selected and the witness are of different races. Why? Because it's difficult to identify someone of a different race. That's what the science has shown. That's what the law says.
Okay,
Paul Connor.
As to the science, can you just write?
Okay, sustained as to the science comment, please disregard.
The law asks you to consider it, there's a reason that the law asked you to consider the races of the two individuals and whether it's cross-racial. There's a reason for that. Paul Connor is a white man from Kentucky who's been in Miami for 3 years, and Rashaun Jones is a black male. That's something that you're going to be instructed to consider. You're also going to be instructed to consider whether the identification was the product of the eyewitness's own recollection or was the result of influence or suggestiveness. What you heard about the lineup and the administration of that lineup in 2007 was that Detective Dominguez was aware of who the individuals in that lineup were. That lineup isn't recorded. The procedure is not recorded. We don't know what was said. We don't know what was done. We don't know what body language was used by Detective Dominguez. We don't know if there was anything that might have suggested the identity of the person in that lineup. Let's also take a look at the lineup that included Mr. Jones and compare it with the lineup that included the other individual, the other suspect. Do we see a difference between these two lineups? Do we see a difference in the lighting and the quality of the pictures and the details that you can see in this one versus the one that included Rashaun Jones? Rashaun Jones' picture in this lineup is a black blur. There's a shadow around his chin. There's a shadow around the sides of his face. You can barely see any of the facial details. There's a dark background that sticks out. His background is darker than the background of the other individuals in these photographs. He's the darkest one. He stands out because of the background and because of the quality of that picture. That's suggestive in and of itself. Plus, we don't know what was said by Detective Dominguez or done by Detective Dominguez whenever he showed that to him. You heard testimony that the way they do it now is single pieces of paper. One piece of paper for each photograph. Detective Segovia testified that sometimes the photographs are larger, sometimes the photographs aren't larger, but they're each printed on their own individual piece of paper. How accurate can you be about someone's identity when you're looking at a 1-inch by 1-inch photograph of their blurry face in a shadow? You can't be. You're also, under the current procedures today, looking at one person at a time. So you're not in a situation where you're looking at a group of people and trying to pick the one that closest resembles the person who you might remember that you saw 1 to 2 seconds at night without your glasses on 7 months ago. The lineup was done improperly. There was also a moment, and I think this will draw a distinction between proper and improper, between something that makes sense and something that doesn't. During Paul Connor's testimony, he's asked by the prosecutor to step down and stand in front of him and ask if he can see him clearly. What's the difference? And he says yes. What's the difference between that and the lineup and the interaction that he had with this person who ran past him or walked past him, depending on which version of his testimony you're considering? Well, the prosecutor, white male. Paul Connor, white male. They're also standing still across from each other. They're not moving. They're not walking past each other. It's in a well-lit courtroom. It's not nighttime. Paul Connor's paying attention. Paul Connor's looking him in the face. He's being asked to look directly at him in the face and say whether or not he can see him clearly. He wasn't asked to pay attention to this person who walked past him. He said he didn't even think anything of it until the next day. Another thing Paul Connor said was clean white smile. Very clear about clean white smile during his testimony. This person appeared pleasant to him and smiled at him, and he had a clean white smile. You heard from Bruce Johnson. He described Rashaun Jones' teeth in 2006 as jagged, and he said they had some color on them. And he was asked whether or not he would describe it as a clean white smile, and Bruce Johnson said no, absolutely not. His teeth were jagged, and they had color on them, not a clean white smile. That's the main thing that that's the main thing that Paul Connor recalls was this clean white smile. That is not Rashaun Jones based on the evidence that you heard during this case. Another factor that you're going to be instructed to consider is witness familiarity. with the subject identified. Now, there's this concept of subconscious transference. We've all been in a situation where someone looks familiar to us. We feel like we may have seen this.
Objection, Judge.
Sustained.
Sometimes we misremember where we've seen people. If someone's face looks familiar to us, we might think they're from one place, we might think they're from work or some interaction, but they're actually from another place. You see a person's face who might be an actor, something like that. You might have think you saw them in one movie, but then it turns out to be something else. You can misapply where you've seen people and the situation. You can get it wrong. What do we know about Paul Connor? Where could he have possibly seen Rashaun Jones' face before without actually realizing it? With being in one of those situations where someone's face looks familiar, but he gets the timing wrong, gets the situation wrong, gets the context wrong. Paul Connor said he's a University of Miami football fan. Rashaun Jones was on the football team. Now the government says he wasn't a starter. He wasn't a starter. But let's think about that. If Rashaun Jones wasn't starting the majority of the time on the football team, he would be on the sideline. If he's on the sideline, he would have his helmet off. If he has his helmet off and someone's watching the football game, Paul Connor said he used his glasses when he watched the football game in his testimony because he could see better whenever he had his glasses on. You could see their face more clearly. Maybe he saw Rashaun Jones' face on the sideline at one of those football games. Paul Connor also testified that he used to look at ESPN roster photos of the football team to see if he had any football players in his classes. We know that he then saw Rashaun's roster picture. We know that he's seen it. Paul Connor was a professor at the University of Miami from 2004 to 2007. Rashaun Jones was a student and an athlete at the University of Miami from 2004 to 2007. The same period of time, 3 years. Detective Segovia told you he pulled the class schedule, he pulled the teaching schedule and Rashaun's schedule, and they were never in the same class. First of all, are either of those pieces in evidence? Are you going to trust Detective Segovia's word for that? Second of all, just because they were not in the same class doesn't mean that they didn't cross paths at the university. Detective Segovia told you that he didn't see which building Paul Connor was teaching in. He didn't see which building Rashaun had classes in. He's not sure if Paul Connor taught a class in the same building that Rashaun was taking a class with another professor. He told you he's not sure if they might have crossed paths in that building. He told you he's not sure if they might have crossed paths on their way to and from courses that Paul Connor was teaching and that Rashaun was taking. Paul Connor testified that he eats lunch in the cafeteria with the students. He mingles with the students in the cafeteria. Subconscious transference. He could have seen Rashaun.
Sustained.
To strike.
He could have seen Rashaun Jones' face at any one of those points and misremembered the context. When asked to identify a person and put with a line up in front of them, he recognizes a face but misremembers where he recognized that face from. And 7.5 months after he encountered this individual for 1 to 2 seconds without his glasses at night, he made a mistake. He made a mistake. How many football games were between November of 2007 and November of 2006 and June of 2007, whenever Paul Connor made that selection in that lineup? How many football games had Paul Connor watched? How many times had him and Rashaun Jones crossed paths on the University of Miami campus? You heard testimony that after Rashaun finished his 2-game suspension, he came back. He came back to the football team. He was back on campus the next day. Let's talk about this 2020 situation where Detective Segovia talks to Paul Connor and says, hey, look at the same exact lineup that you previously saw with the people in the same exact position and tell me if you can remember making the selection. Didn't change the position, didn't change the pictures, didn't use the department's new policy of putting them on a single piece of paper each and showing them separately. Showed them the same exact picture and just said, hey, do you remember this? When you're considering the factors for whether or not it's reliable, is that suggestive? Showing him the same exact set of pictures in the same exact position? 20 years later, 15 years later? And then Paul Connor testified. You heard him testify. The defense attorney asked him a question. You remembered the position of the picture you selected. And he said, if I have to be honest, then yes, I remembered the location of the picture. He was specifically asked, I wrote it down. When the detective showed you this new lineup in 2020, was Mr. Jones, where was Mr. Jones' location? It's the same. And your testimony is you recall Mr. Jones being in the second position at the top? Answer, I would have to be truthful and say yes. He remembered the position, the same exact lineup that he had seen. No change. Didn't take the time to create a new lineup with the new procedures, administer it again, give the warnings that he testified about, none of that. There's a reason why Paul Connor selected Mr. Jones' picture June 24th of 2007 and nobody made an arrest. The officers knew that this was unreliable, that this was not the type of lineup that you can put any sort of weight behind because of all the factors that we discussed. The government knew that this was not an identification, not a lineup that you can put any sort of weight behind. And it's not until 2020, after 15 years, when a new detective gets assigned to the case, all of a sudden now it becomes enough. It becomes credible. And then he shows him the same exact lineup again. Paul Connor's testimony also has a ton of conflicts in it. If you listen to his testimony, he testified that the reason he took the train that day was because his car was in the shop. Couldn't tell you what shop, couldn't tell you where the shop was, couldn't give you any details about the shop, but then also testified that the reason he found out that something had happened at the apartment complex that night was because he was driving his car out of the complex and saw police and police tape. And he's questioned about this. Well, could you be mistaken? Yes, I could be mistaken. His whole recollection is wrong. He's also misremembering when the police came and spoke to him. He's misremembering the date that's on the sketch that he did. He's certain that it was November 8th, but the sketch says November 9th. And let's talk about this sketch for a second. Does this look anything like Rashaun Jones? Does this look anything like Rashaun Jones? Nothing. Paul Connor's selection is not reliable. It is not credible. Paul Connor's selection should be taught in law schools and at police academies.
Objection, Judge. Move to strike.
It had every single mark of a false identification, every single indicator of a false.
Objection, Judge. Move to strike.
Move to strike, but I'll sustain the objection. Move on.
You'll be instructed to consider the factors when weighing eyewitness identifications and selections. Paul Connor's selection has issues in every single category. This was a misidentification, and everybody knew it until 2021. Let's talk about the other evidence in the case. All the evidence that is completely innocent information, completely innocent behaviors that now, 20 years later, the government's trying to spin into a motive, to try and spin into a murder. We spent days hearing about a dorm room fight in 2004. A fight that happened summer of 2004, so 2.5 years before the murder of Bryan Pata. 2.5 years. And the government's telling you that because a fight that happened 2.5 years before, Rashaun Jones went and shot him in the head because he failed a drug test? What did the witnesses who testified about that fight say? Eric Moncourt said Rashaun Jones didn't want to fight. Rashaun Jones wasn't the aggressor. He didn't want any sort of conflict with Bryan Pata. Eric Moncourt testified that he thought that everything was quashed after this. He didn't hear anything else about it. He didn't think that this was a continuing issue. He wasn't aware of any issues after this. Eric Moncourt testified that there's fights between players all the time. How many of the football players testified about the locker room dynamic and how there's fights in the locker room? It's not uncommon. It's a situation where there's a lot of alpha males, a lot of testosterone, a lot of competitive people, a lot of conflicting personalities. And this is something that happens in a locker room. There's fights. There's arguments. There's people who don't necessarily gel together, people who aren't on speaking terms, people who don't get along, people who don't hang out. And that's completely normal. Everybody testified to that. Kareem Brown testified that him and Bryan Pata used to get in arguments every single day. It's normal. There's fights. This is nothing out of the ordinary. This is a locker room dynamic for a Division I football team. A fight 2 years before is not motive. The Jada stuff. A bunch of testimony about how Rashaun and Jada might have had a thing at one point, sort of informal, and there was gossip about it. Everybody who testified about it said that there was nothing more going on once Jada and Bryan Pata started dating in fall of 2005. There might have been a conversation where Bryan Pata went and told Rashaun, hey, that's my girl now. And Rashaun said, yeah, all cool, that's fine. No issues, no further issues. There was no testimony that Rashaun was continuing to try and be with Jada or get with Jada. He had his own girlfriend in November of 2006, Sherry Abramson, who let him drive her Range Rover, and she drove a Maserati. She got him phones. She gave him money. What's he jealous for? He's not jealous. This was something in the past that, like he said in his statement, got blown out of proportion. It got exaggerated. Because when he didn't go to that meeting, when he chose not to go to that meeting because he had failed a drug test, he was down in the dumps according to Bruce Johnson, didn't want to go. Now all of a sudden, the narratives start turning. This thing that happened 2 years ago starts coming up and gets blown out of proportion. The situation with Jada before Bryan and Jada started dating gets blown out of proportion. It gets spun up and spun up. And now people are testifying 20 years later, after hearing all the coverage in this case, after being called by ESPN to discuss this case and asked these types of questions. Now they're testifying 20 years later. It's snowballed. It's not motive for murder. It's not jealousy. The government's also arguing that Bryan Pata was going to be drafted to the NFL, which is another reason why Rashaun was jealous enough to kill him. And that Rashaun wasn't getting that much playing time, which is why Rashaun was jealous enough to kill him. How many people testified who were on that team who went to the NFL? That team was full of NFL players. This wasn't unique to Bryan Pata. He was a talented football player. He was going to get drafted, but it was not a unique situation. There were a lot of people who ended up in the NFL. Bruce Johnson, the person who was closest to Rashaun, went to the NFL. There's a lot of people who went to the NFL. Bryan and Rashaun didn't play the same position. It's not like they were competing for a starting job. It's not like Bryan Pata was the one who was keeping Rashaun from any playing time. Completely different positions. And all the players who came and testified told you about how the position groups ran together. The linemen were in one section of the locker room. The linemen hung out together. DBs, separated section of the locker room, far away. They hung out together. They were all in their own position groups. That's who they hung out with. There was no direct competition between Bryan and Rashaun Jones. Not the type of competition that can drive someone to commit a homicide. Let's break this down. The government's theory of prosecution in this case is that Rashaun Jones failed his second drug test. Not his first drug test, where this is the first time that this has happened and this is a new thing that he's dealing with. Not his third drug test, where he's now going to get kicked off the team. He failed his second drug test. And he misses some class sometimes. And he gets in trouble sometimes for being late to meetings. And he has such a break He's so upset that he failed his second drug test that he shoots his teammate in the head. Does that make any sense, members of the jury? Does that make any sense at all? Let's talk about the evidence surrounding the firearm, the projectile. The government is asking you to make so many leaps, so many jumps, to link this projectile to Rashaun Jones. First of all, you have to believe that the firearms analyst was accurate in saying that this is 100% a .38 caliber bullet. He testified that he took measurements. He testified that he didn't write the measurements down, couldn't tell you what the measurements were, but knows that, he took the measurements and it was consistent, but he couldn't tell you what they were. He talked about how damaged the bullet was and how he took measurements off of a damaged bullet, was able to say it was a .38 caliber. So first you have to believe that the projectile was a .38 caliber. Then the next leap that you have to take is that the murder weapon would have had to have been a .38 caliber. Because the firearms analyst, Mr. Hertel, testified that the fire weapon very well could have been a .357 firearm. Could have been a .357 revolver, could have been a .357 semi-automatic handgun, could have been a .357 rifle, could have been a .357 Derringer. So now you have to assume that all of those were not the murder weapon. Then you have to assume that David Howell is telling the truth. And let's talk about David Howell for a second. He testified that on the stand, Rashaun showed him a gun in Patricia Dunak's dorm room, in a friend's dorm room, right? And then when Detective Segovia was being questioned, he was asked about another statement that David Howell made when he said it happened in his dorm room. So he has the places different. David Howell was also very close with Eric Moncourt. Eric Moncourt told you how close him and David Howell were. They were both linemen, and they ran around in the same group. They spoke almost every day, he said. Eric Moncourt said he never heard anything, ever. Never heard anything at all, ever, about Rashaun Jones having a gun. Never heard anything about it. David Howell didn't mention it one time. And while we're here, let's talk about these locker room rumors that nobody was able to directly testify about. Just a couple witnesses, Kareem Brown and David Howell, talking about the rumors. How is it a rumor if Eric Moncourt never heard anything about a firearm? How is it a rumor if Bruce Johnson never heard anything about a firearm? How is it a rumor if Dwayne Hendricks didn't hear anything about a firearm? What did Dwayne Hendricks say when he was asked about Rashaun Jones? Rashaun Jones was always talking about girls. Rashaun Jones was always talking about girls. Didn't say anything about guns or firearms or anything like that. The only two witnesses in this case who say anything about Rashaun with a gun, which is directly contradicted by the other witnesses, both police officers now. They're both working with law enforcement. The only two witnesses who say anything about Rashaun having a gun, 20 years later. So David Howell said revolver, small caliber, could have been .38, could have been another small caliber. So now the next assumption we have to make to link this projectile to Rashaun Jones is that what David Howell saw, if he's telling the truth, was a .38 caliber. And then we have to assume that the .38 caliber David Howell saw, if he's telling the truth, was one of the brands of .38 caliber that Hertel talked about, because there were specific brands listed. And then we have to take another assumption that says not only was it one of those brands, but it was the exact gun that was used in the homicide. We're 5 layers removed from the actual evidence in this case, the actual projectile, and anything to do with Rashaun Jones. And that's assuming that you find that the witnesses who testified about this are credible. Kareem Brown, the other witness besides David Howell, who says anything about Rashaun and firearms. He says they're at practice or a team-related event, and Rashaun Jones comes up to him, even though they've never had a one-to-one conversation ever. Kareem Brown testified. They never.
Judge Fox, not an evidence.
All right. Overall, you can continue.
Kareem Brown testified, that him and Rashaun Jones had never had a one-on-one conversation. They'd never spoken one-to-one. They're in different positions, different groups. They don't hang out. But all of a sudden, Rashaun Jones walks up to him after practice one day or after a team event and says, "Hey, big bruh, I got that .38 on me." Does that make any sense? Does that make any sense at all? Somebody you've never spoken to ever, you're going to tell them, I got a gun on me? That makes no sense. Also, if they're coming back from practice, he obviously wouldn't have had a gun on him at practice. He might have had his jersey on him, which was number 38, if that statement even occurred. What else did Kareem Brown say while we're talking about him? He testified that the University of Miami is a relatively small community. It's small compared to some of these larger football schools. And the people who stay on campus, even smaller. And that the football players would commingle and intermingle with the same group of females who lived on campus. And it wasn't unusual for football players to have had relations in the past with the same girl. Again, not something that's unusual. Jada having a thing with Rashaun and then dating Bryan Pata, not something that's out of the ordinary, not something that's unheard of. Just like the fights. Just like the fact that they weren't necessarily best friends. They weren't on speaking terms. They didn't interact. They didn't hang out. All of this, completely normal. Completely normal for this locker room, for this team dynamic. And that's what the witnesses said. I also want to talk about this idea, going back to Paul Connor for a second, that the government has been trying to tell you about Rashaun Jones running from his apartment, running down, committing a homicide, running back up to his apartment. First of all, Detective Segovia testified, because he's the one who drew this line, about how Paul Connor told him he was sprinting between buildings. If you listen to Paul Connor's testimony, he's asked about this directly. He says, did you ever tell anybody that you saw this person sprinting between buildings? And Paul Connor says, I know that's in one of the reports, but I did not say that. I didn't say that. He denies ever saying that. That comes from Segovia. Paul Connor says that didn't happen. He says he turned around, saw his back for a second, never saw him turn and start running. So this is not based on Paul Connor's testimony. First of all. Second of all, Paul Connor said he didn't observe any sweat on this individual that he saw. But the government's trying to say that Rashaun Jones is in good shape. He's a football player, works out all the time. So he ran down, committed a murder, and then began leaving. And Paul Connor didn't see any sweat on this person? It doesn't make sense. It's a conflict in the evidence. Also, if Rashaun Jones was on that road in that area, going where Paul Connor says he saw this person go, Dwayne Hendricks is on his way back from practice as well. Dwayne Hendricks testifies he drives down that road and comes in. Dwayne Hendricks would have crossed paths with Rashaun Jones. Dwayne Hendricks would have recognized Rashaun Jones because he knows Rashaun Jones. Dwayne Hendricks didn't see Rashaun Jones anywhere that night. He didn't see him once, not when he's driving home. And the government keeps saying that Rashaun got this call from Bruce Johnson, so he knew practice was over. He knew when to go. Well, if he knew practice was over, he also knew that football players lived at the Colony Apartments. He knew that Dwayne Hendricks was Bryan Pata's roommate. He knew that they would be coming back at the same time. So he would decide to then go and commit a homicide in open public while he knows that other football players are going to be returning there because he knows that they live there. That doesn't make any sense. Let's talk about that phone call with Bruce Johnson. Bruce Johnson calls him before the death of Bryan Pata at 6:41. And then he speaks to him again at 7:40, at 7. 7:39. I remember. Bruce Johnson says he didn't notice anything unusual about that call. He didn't notice anything unusual about either of those calls. He didn't notice that he was out of breath. He didn't notice that he was panicked. He didn't notice that he was frantic. Nothing. He's known Rashaun Jones since Rashaun Jones and him played youth football together. If they're on a phone 39 minutes after Rashaun Jones had just committed a homicide, or 19 minutes before Rashaun Jones goes to commit a homicide, he would have noticed something off. He would have noticed that something wasn't right. He would have heard something in his voice. He would have known. But no, he says, no, nothing unusual. I told him about the meeting. I told him about it. Nothing unusual at all. In the call before, he told me about failing his drug test. I didn't notice anything unusual. At the very least, he would have heard that he was out of breath if he ran all the way there like the government's saying. Now after Rashaun Jones gets Pat Diaz, who comes and puts a card at his house. Rashaun Jones calls Pat Diaz, speaks to Pat Diaz, agrees to an interview with Pat Diaz, cooperates. Pat Diaz goes back to his house a second time, leaves a card. Again, Rashaun reaches out and makes contact, speaks to him. Pat Diaz says, why didn't you say anything about Jada last time? He's like, well, you didn't ask about Jada. But doesn't hide it. He has nothing to hide. Speaking to police. And then this third time, the government wants to make it seem like Rashaun Jones was trying to keep Sherry from saying anything to the police. But Sherry testified, and Sherry told you that she got this call, and Rashaun said, no, go speak to him, it's fine. And then when they get back, Rashaun makes a statement about how he doesn't want them speaking to her alone, protective boyfriend. But then when the detectives explain the situation to him, and the detectives say, like, no, we have to interview witnesses one at a time, we want to make sure it's one at a time. What did Pat Diaz say? He was cool with it. He had no issue. There was no issue. Once they explained it to him, there was no issue. He was cooperative with everything that he was asked to do. When he's taken into custody in 2021, he walks into that interview room. He's read his Miranda rights. He's told that you don't have to speak to me at all. The law says you do not have to speak to me. And he says, let's go. Let's speak. He was eager to speak with Detective Segovia. You hear that on the recording. He's eager to speak with him. And they do. They speak for 2 hours. And I know the government told you that Detective Segovia was trying to give him an out. Detective Segovia was trying to get him to give some sort of reasonable explanation for why he might have been in the area. Do not get it mistaken. He was under arrest. There was nothing that Rashaun Jones could have said to get him out of there. If he could have given an explanation for being on scene, and he did, he would have been in handcuffs. Again, he would have stayed in handcuffs. This wasn't a reasonable chance to explain anything. This was, let's see what we can get him to say. Rashaun Jones didn't take the bait. He didn't take the bait when Detective Segovia was trying to say, look, I'm trying to give you a chance. If there's a reason why you could be there, if there's a reason why you were in the area, maybe we can get you out of this. He didn't take it. He said, no, I wasn't there. I wasn't there. I wasn't there that night. I was at my house. Which is consistent with the phone records. Sergeant Cremasini testified about the cell site locations and the phone records. And he talked to you about 2 calls that ping off of this tower to sort of near the crime scene. And he said he can't exclude the possibility that Rashaun's phone would ping there from his house. But let's assume that it didn't. Between those 2 pings at 3:55 p.m. and 8:57 p.m., Sergeant Cremasini testified that all the calls were consistent with Rashaun Jones being at home. They were all pinging off of his home towers, the towers that are consistent with him sitting in his living room. That's what Sergeant Cremasini testified to. That directly supports what Rashaun Jones told the officers. I was at home. And every call made during that period of time is consistent. The cell tower information is consistent with him being at home. The government also wants to point at Rashaun Jones' statement that he gave 15 years later and try and be nitpicky about times and he said he called Bruce Johnson and then he called Sherry, but he also called a few people in between. He's being interviewed 15 years later. He remembers some conversations. He can't remember every single thing that he's being asked about. He can't remember every single detail of everything. He remembers the things that stand out to him. He remembers that he failed the drug test that day and he was suspended. He remembers that he didn't go to the team meeting because he was upset about failing the drug test and didn't want to be around those people. He remembers changing his phone number because, again, he didn't want people reaching out and nagging him. And he changes his phone number before the murder occurs. Why would somebody change their phone number, put their phone number in their name before a homicide if they were trying to conceal anything? That doesn't make any sense at all. Why you would change your phone number, get it put in your name as some sort of preparation to commit a crime? It doesn't make any sense. And Sherry testified that he was always changing his number. Sure, her parents owned Verizon stores. She was able to help him and get him phones. That doesn't make any sense why he would change his number. And then going back to the calls and the calling people, because the government argued that why is he calling all these people if he didn't want anybody bugging him? Well, before he learned about this death of Bryan Pata, he calls a select few people. He calls his friend, he calls his girlfriend, people who he wants to have his number, probably people that he wants to confide in, people that he wants to talk to about the situation. That's who he calls. And then once he learns this information, then there's a number of calls that happen. But you can imagine, and when something like this happens, whenever your whole team is being affected by this situation, all the students are talking about it. There's students calling. Everybody's, calling back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I also want to talk about this idea that Sherry lied to cover for Rashaun by telling officers that she wasn't able to get in touch with Rashaun around the time of the murder. If she was trying to cover for Rashaun, she wouldn't have said that, I don't know where he was at the time of the homicide. Right? That doesn't sound like something you would say when you cover for somebody. And then we know that they were on the phone. He speaks to Bruce Johnson at 7:40 something, and then him and Sherry have a conversation, 2 calls, and then at around 8:30 they have another phone call. They're in communication there. Now there are a number of calls that happened later that night. Maybe Sherry was confused about the timing. Maybe she did call him, but it wasn't around the time of the homicide. It was around the time where he was supposed to be coming to see her. She's wondering, what's taking you so long? So she calls him. And then whenever she's asked about this later, who knows how much longer later, she says, I was calling him a bunch. I was worried about him because another football player had got shot. I just learned that someone else was shot, so I was calling him. Later in the night, a few hours later, Rashaun also, whenever he testified, wasn't able to be 100% accurate about the times because it's 15 years later. Unrelated to the time of the homicide occurring or anything where she might have thought that Rashaun was going to get blamed for something. She doesn't remember making that statement 15 years later. Let's talk about the blocking of the numbers. So we see here, Rashaun uses star 67 to dial Sherry's number, but then 56 minutes later, she calls him at that number. So she had his number, she got his number. Were there any text messages that were going on at the time? Did the government get any text messages at the time? Did they see if anything was being discussed on text message, if he maybe texted her his number so that she would have it? We don't know why he blocked the number there. Who knows? There's 1,000 different reasons why he might have used star 67. I use star 67 for 1,000 different reasons. It doesn't mean murder. It doesn't equal murder, especially whenever she's calling him back. She has his contact information. It doesn't make sense. Again, these are innocent facts. When you look at them, it does not equal murder. And then 20 years later, the government's they talk about puzzles. They're trying to take a piece from this puzzle and a piece from that puzzle and a piece from this puzzle and jam them all together and put a picture together and try to tell you that this equals murder. It doesn't. These puzzle pieces do not fit together. There's not a single piece of direct, credible evidence that links Rashaun Jones to this homicide. Nothing. And the evidence that you heard during this trial about 2.5 years, the conflict, and nothing that's unusual based on the team dynamic, and the phone records that are consistent with him being at home during that entire time, it shows this is not the truth. What the government is trying to say is not the truth. Taking these different puzzle pieces from different puzzles and putting them together does not make a picture that proves this case beyond and to the exclusion of reasonable doubt. It does not. I might have mentioned this, but I'm going to say it again. When he changed his number, it was in his name, and then he was calling people, and they had his number. He's not trying to hide anything. And whenever he calls these detectives, right, because Pat Diaz said, we left a card, he got in touch with us. Was he calling them from his number that he changed? Was he hiding it? Was he hiding his number from police? Was he hiding it from investigators? No, he had nothing to hide from investigators at any point. Now, Mike Sanders asking for money. Why he was asking for money, the government really hasn't said. That he's trying to maybe have gotten a get out of town or something. He had a vehicle. The witnesses who testified that he had a vehicle that he could use to drive out of town if he wanted to. He had a girlfriend who did have money. So if Mike Sanders, said no for whatever reason, and then Sherry actually was trying to cover for him and he was trying to skip town, Sherry could have got him a bus ticket, a plane ticket, got him out of town. None of that. Mike Sanders' family owned KFC franchises. He testified that was known around the campus. People knew that his family was well off. He said he couldn't tell you whether or not Rashaun had asked for money before. He can't recall that. And he couldn't recall much. He couldn't recall the time where he called Rashaun back. Can't tell you what happened on that phone call. Can't tell you anything about what happened there. And context matters whenever we're talking about a witness and the government's trying to say that Rashaun calling and maybe asking for money is somehow evidence of murder. Context matters. How does he not remember that second phone call? The only thing he remembers about the first phone call is Rashaun called him and asked him for money. Doesn't remember anything else that was said on that phone call. Maybe Rashaun was embarrassed. Maybe Rashaun, his girlfriend Sherry, had just got him a new phone that day. She already helped him out enough. Maybe Rashaun was running out of money, was embarrassed to reach out to Sherry and ask for more help after she had already got him a phone, calls Mike Sanders. Not a single witness who testified in this trial could tell you anything about Rashaun Jones' financial situation. They couldn't tell you anything. Nothing. Nobody pulled his bank records. Nobody wanted to see what his balances were. None of it. We do know, at the very least, he was calling to check his account balance at star 225 to see how much money he had left on his account. So he had that issue. Called the 1-800 number. The bank. And this gap of time argument, where there's no phone calls made for 58 minutes. Sergeant Cremesini testified that whether the phone was on or off, there would have been records of calls coming in, whether it was on or off. All that means is that nobody called for that period of time. That's all that means. A gap in time doesn't mean that the phone was turned off, doesn't mean it was left at home, doesn't mean anything. It just means no calls were coming in. And then between 4:11 and 5:07, another 56-minute gap, there's no calls, no phone calls made. Nothing happened during that period of time. And Sergeant Cremesini was asked, how long have you been in the courtroom? Have you been here for, 56 minutes? By the time he left this courtroom, he had been here for 56 minutes. Just because you don't make a call or receive a call for 56 minutes, that doesn't mean that you're committing a crime, that you're killing someone. Again, another piece of innocent evidence that the government is trying to frame to piece all these misfit puzzle pieces together and create a murder. In 2020, when Detective Segovia took over this case, he selected the suspect and made the evidence fit. Painted a narrative of normal facts that are completely normal for everybody on that football team. Fights, hooking up with the same girls, not hanging out with everybody, maybe not gelling with somebody. And he took that and spun it into a narrative. And now we're here today, 20 years later, because that narrative got spun. 20 years later. How many detectives worked on this case between 2006 and 2020? I think there was testimony that there was dozens and dozens and dozens of detectives who worked on this case and investigated this case. For 20 years, 15 years, by 2021. And not a single one of them was smart enough to say, oh, you know what, it's Rashaun Jones. No, it was just when Detective Segovia got on the case and was tasked with reevaluating all the evidence and looking at everything like he was working it anew. That's what he testified about. He was the only person smart enough to crack this case after 15 years. The only one. Except for when asked questions about anything to do with anybody besides Rashaun Jones, he doesn't remember. Someone else cleared that lead. Someone else cleared that lead. Oh, I don't know. Oh, the fingerprints that were found on the hood of the car, the fingerprints found on the hood that were matched to a guy, found on the hood of the car at the murder scene with the dead body feet away, those fingerprints that were matched to somebody, that guy was excluded. Who excluded him? I don't know. How was he excluded? I don't know. Do you want to review the previous lead detective's report to see if it can refresh your memory about what was done to investigate this person? You reviewed it. Oh, no, didn't refresh my memory. No clue. This individual who Detective Dominguez, the original detective, mistakenly believed was in custody at the time, didn't find that out, didn't realize that mistake had been made, that this one lead, this one potential suspect, was actually out of custody at the time of the homicide. Didn't find that out until after Rashaun Jones was arrested. Didn't find that out until after he had already put Mr. Jones in handcuffs and interviewed him and made up his mind about who the perpetrator was. He was supposed to look at everything again, new, restart the investigation, review all the leads. He had his mind made up. He had his suspect. All he had to do was make it fit, was make the evidence fit the suspect. That is not how it works in the United States of America with the Constitution of the United States. That is not how that works. And that's exactly what happened in this case. Now, whenever you're instructed in a moment, you're going to be instructed that reasonable doubt comes from three places: evidence, conflicts in the evidence, and a lack of evidence. And we've discussed a lot of the evidence already. All the testimony that you heard from the witnesses, the pictures that you've seen. Bruce Johnson testifying he never saw Rashaun with a gun, never had information about Rashaun having a gun. Sherry Abramson saying that she never had any information that Rashaun had a gun. Eric Minefor saying he never had any information or heard about Rashaun having a gun. Dwayne Hendricks saying the only thing he knows about Rashaun is that he likes to talk about girls a lot. All of that evidence, the cell site data that shows he's in this location, that's consistent with him being at his house, in these 5 hours surrounding the murder, all of this evidence, the information that you heard about Paul Connor and his 20/40 vision at night without glasses, the lighting conditions, 1 to 2 seconds he saw this person, selected him in a photo lineup 7.5 months later. All of that evidence exists because Rashaun Jones is innocent. All of that evidence exists and is reasonable doubt because Rashaun Jones was not responsible for Bryan Pata's death. Let's talk about some conflicts in the evidence. We spoke about some conflicts already, but all the conflicts in Paul Connor's testimony about the train and his car being in the shop, the conflict between what Paul Connor says and what Detective Segovia says, and Paul Connor saying that he'd never made that statement that Detective Segovia said that he made. The Dave Howell conflicts between where he claims that he had seen this gun. That Eric Moncourt, Dave Howell's close friend who spoke all the time, never heard anything about it. Everything in this case conflicts with your common sense, and you're going to be instructed to use your common sense whenever you're weighing the evidence and determining whether or not the government has met its burden to prove beyond it to the exclusion of every single reasonable doubt that Rashaun Jones is responsible. You're going to be asked to use your common sense. and everything that you've heard and the argument that the government is making conflicts with your common sense. Conflicts with anybody's common sense. The idea that Rashaun Jones would fail his second drug test and go into such a deep spiral that he wants to commit murder on a person that he got in a fight with 2.5 years ago and had a unofficial thing with his girlfriend a 1.5 years ago. It doesn't make sense. It does not make sense. It conflicts with common sense. Another conflict in the evidence. Detective Hellman was questioned about whether or not he was able to pull all the phone records for Bryan Pata. First of all, we don't have any phone records for Bryan Pata that have been introduced into evidence. When Detective Segovia was questioned about it, he said, there was a bunch of phone records. I'm not exactly sure. But Detective Hellman said he wasn't able to pull the phone records from the Nextel chirps, from the walkie-talkie function on the Nextel phone. Today, when Sergeant Cremacini testified, he did mention that there was some sort of information, some sort of data from a Nextel chirp. That's a conflict in the evidence. Where are those Nextel chirps? Where are those records? Why haven't we seen those? Would it not be useful to see who the people who Bryan Pata were talking to just before his murder are? Where are those records? Where are they? We have Rashaun's records. They don't show a single call to Bryan Pata. There's no calls to him. That's a conflict in the evidence. The not having Nextel chirps, but having Nextel chirps and being able to see, that's a conflict. That's a reasonable doubt. Let's talk about the lack of evidence in this case. There is no gun. No gun was ever recovered. No gun was ever found on Rashaun Jones. No gun was ever found that could be linked to Rashaun Jones. No gun was ever found whatsoever in this case. There is no forensic evidence in this case, besides the fingerprints on the car to the person who was excluded somehow, but you can't really say how. Nobody really knows exactly what was done to exclude that person as a lead. No fingerprints for Rashaun Jones on the scene. No fingerprints from Rashaun Jones on the hood of that car. No fingerprints from Rashaun Jones on a gate nearby. Nothing. Not a single piece of forensic evidence linking Rashaun Jones to this. No DNA either. No DNA on the car. No DNA on the gate. No DNA on anything. No DNA on Bryan Pata's body. Nothing. There was testimony about how they didn't really use cameras back then. But you heard about 2 places where they tried to get cameras from. They tried to get cameras from a hotel, and they tried to get cameras from a Circuit City. This is Dadeland Mall. This is Dadeland Mall. And the government's theory of this case is that Rashaun Jones ran all the way home from Dadeland Mall, or past Dadeland Mall to get to his house. Ran all the way home. Did anybody go to Dadeland Mall and see if there was a camera of the exterior to see if there was anything there that might have shown anybody running past? Did anybody testify that they tried to get cameras from Dadeland Mall and that Dadeland Mall was, didn't have any cameras on the exterior? Nope, nobody tried. Now, the government told you during voir dire, one of the things that they've talked about a lot, and one of the things that they may say when they come up here to speak with you again, is that they don't have to prove motive. They don't have to prove motive. They're going to say, it's not an element of the crime, we don't have to prove it. They have to prove a crime that makes sense. They have to prove beyond and to the exclusion of every single reasonable doubt their case. And if they didn't have to prove motive, they certainly spent a lot of time in this case trying. A lot of time talking about this fight from summer of 2004. A lot of time talking about this clip-up statement. A lot of time talking about, these rumors and the situationship, whatever happened between Rashaun and Jada years before. Spent a lot of time trying to prove motive. And they failed because there was no motive. It doesn't make sense. There is no motive because Rashaun Jones did not kill Bryan Pata. How many witnesses were there to testify in this case about any actual evidence at all that links Rashaun Jones to this crime? Maybe if Paul Connor was a credible witness who wasn't nearsighted and farsighted and was wearing his glasses and it wasn't nighttime and he saw this person for more than 1 to 2 seconds and he made a selection from a photo lineup more than or less than 7.5 months afterwards, maybe, but not with those facts. Every single witness that the government called, 99% of their testimony was about stuff from the past, 2 years before. Why were you hearing about all that stuff? The reason you had to hear about this dorm room fight from 2004 and this clip-up statement and this thing with maybe Jada is because that's all they have. That's the only evidence in this case. Those are the pieces of different puzzles they're trying to put together to tell a story. We'll get to that in a second because there is something I missed. Let's talk about Paul Connor again. Paul Connor says he got to the train station at 7:35 and it takes him about 25 minutes to walk home from the train station to get to his apartment complex. And then Detective Segovia testified.
The statement of fact, he said 6:35, not 7:35.
Okay, rely on your recollection of the evidence.
I'm sorry, if I said 7:35, I apologize. He said he got to the train station at 6:35 p.m. and it takes him about 25 minutes to walk to the apartment complex. And then when Detective Segovia testified, he testified that it would take about 30 minutes to walk to the apartment complex. Either way, he gets there at 7 o'clock. What do we know happened right at 7 o'clock? Jada Brody is on a 911 call, screaming. She had just discovered Bryan. She calls 911 at 7 o'clock, right whenever Paul Connor says that he would have been there. Paul Connor didn't see Jada. Paul Connor didn't see Dwayne Hendricks pull in. Paul Connor didn't see a muzzle flash. Paul Connor saw nothing that would be consistent with what actually happened. And given his confusion with all the dates that you heard about in his testimony and you've heard about with other witnesses, and given his confusion about where his car was, and given the fact that he didn't see anything that was going on at 7 o'clock at this apartment complex, can we even say that, he was there on the day of this homicide? If he's that confused about all of these facts, is the person that he saw even the person who's responsible? Was it a different day? We know the person he saw was not Rashaun Jones, but was it even the suspect? The conflicts in his testimony and the conflicts between his testimony and other evidence that you've heard in this case would say otherwise. And the reason that those conflicts exist is because Rashaun Jones did not commit this crime. Rashaun Jones is innocent. Now I want to use this graph here. I want to talk to you about it.
We're going to object to that. I think it's a misdemeanor law.
Okay, well, let's ask the jurors to step into the jury room. Please turn it so that they're not being hands. All right, Ralph, can you take them into the jury room?
All rise for the jury.
Thank you. You may be seated. In most cases, when counsels together are able to speak, things go much more smoothly. Why would we not have shown each other the boards that we're going to use for closing witnesses to do this outside of cases in the jury? I don't have an answer. So let's go ahead and do it now. I think this is going to probably affect how far we get to it. But let's go ahead and see. Can I see the board?
Yeah.
Dave, do you want to come see the board?
We've seen it, Judge, from here. I think from the state perspective, it's misstates the state's burden. It raises it to a higher level. I think the jury instructions are plain and clear. So from the state's perspective, it's a misdemeanor law.
Yeah, that's kind of like giving percentages for what reasonable doubt is. You're giving shades of colors of. I don't see how that's something that would be admissible. Do you have a different board or a different sheet? Maybe you could rewrite it in a different way?
It's just a demonstrative, Judge. I think it is consistent with what the law is.
I don't think it is. I think it's more like percentages, and the colors, darkening, et cetera, would go to like a 90% colored in, an 80% colored in, a 75%. The shades are it's just an inappropriate way to characterize it. Any other ones that we're going to need to discuss? I just want to do it now.
Yeah, there are 10 other boards there, we haven't seen any of that.
Okay, why don't we take a quick break, let you all show each other the boards?
Are you going to use any other boards?
No.
Okay. All right, so just so you all know, since they're out, it's 6:30, the hour and a half would be, let's say I add 5 minutes or 10 minutes, would have been 6:45. The state still has an extra half an hour, and then I was going to instruct them, which will take another half an hour, and then get them to start deliberating. I don't think it's going to happen tonight, unfortunately. I'm going to ask them when they come back, or when Mr. Roney finishes, if they want to continue for tonight, or they want to come back tomorrow. Just, we've been, standard end time has been between 6 and 7. So
So,
we're not going to get to deliberate tonight for sure.
and Your Honor said, how much longer do I have?
You had, well, you had to 6:45. You started
I
at,
have 20 more minutes left.
yeah, I can add some time because we're taking time off of here.
Well, I think I'm pretty close, and
Whenever you're done.
I would just ask, Judge, that at the very least, the government also give their final close for
They had a
and
half an hour
instruct them.
left. I'm going to ask the jurors if they're willing to stay. We're supposed to end by 7, but let's see, maybe they'll be willing to stay for that, and then I instruct them tomorrow. Okay? All right, so we'll let you finish, and then I'll ask them.
Yeah, Judge, I do have an objection to that.
Okay, thank you.
All yours are good.
All right, thank you. Really seated. Yes.
A couple more things before I wrap up. I want to go back again to Paul Connor. Even ignoring all of the issues with his testimony that we've spoken about ad nauseum, he still can only say that he's 90% sure. Is 90% beyond and to the exclusion of every single reasonable doubt? Taking everything he says is true. There's a 10% chance he's wrong. 1 in 10. Is that 1 in 10 chance? Is that something that will be abiding? Ignoring all the other issues. Is that something that will be abiding, something that you can lay your head on your pillow at night? Tomorrow.
Objection, as to the percentages.
All right. Overruled for now.
Tomorrow, the next day, next week, next month, next year. Something you will not be wondering, oh man, it was only 1 to 2 seconds. It was 7.5 months later. It was dark outside. He does only have 20/40 vision. Is that enough to make you sleep well at night? To make you not have...
Objection, Judge, in reading the problems of the jury.
Sustained.
To make you not have that thought in your head, that waver, that vacillation?
Sustained.
Move to strike.
Okay, please disregard the last statement.
Last thing about Paul Connor, no golds. Why did he mention no golds? Did anybody tell him about golds? Going back to the cross-racial identification factor, did he mention that the person did not have gold teeth because it was a black male that he saw and he threw it in? Where does that come from? Bruce Johnson told you that sometimes Rashaun Jones would wear golds on his teeth. Certainly didn't have a clean white smile like Paul Connor testified about. Paul Connor and his selection are not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They are not credible. The other evidence in this case, the other pieces of these random puzzles that the government has tried to piece together for you do not equal murder. The evidence in this case has shown that Rashaun Jones was at home, consistent with his phone records, consistent with his statement consistent with all the evidence and the lack of evidence and the conflicts of the evidence that you have heard in this case. Now, after I sit down, I will not have a chance to speak to you again. This is the last chance that I will get. And we have tried throughout this trial to do everything that we can do to show you, to give you the tools that you need to see the truth, to see that Rashaun Jones did not commit this crime. We have done everything we can. We have tried. When we sit down, there's nothing more we can do, and it's going to be in your hands. And Rashaun Jones said in that interview that you all heard, he tells Detective Segovia, bring in the jury. Bring him in. This is going to have to go to a jury. And 5 years later, you are Rashaun Jones' jury. You're the jury that he...
Wait,
I'm making a promise to the jury.
oh,
5 years ago, Rashaun Jones told Detective Segovia, take it to a jury. Bring a jury in. And you are Rashaun Jones' jury. When I sit down, there's nothing more I can do with this case. There's no more information I can give you. There's nothing more I can do to try and show you the truth about what happened. But I trust that if you use your common sense, if you look at the evidence and the conflicts of the evidence and the lack of evidence in this case, you'll see that the government's case does not make sense. These puzzle pieces do not fit together. This is not a picture that you can see clearly. Rashaun Jones is not guilty. When you review this evidence and you go back to deliberate, find him not guilty. Find him not guilty. Thank you.
all right, thank you, State.